So, wait, is this? Yeah, this is the beginning. Okay. So, as I was just mentioning before, so the main problem with this chapter, which I had, was disentangling like the two, like the historical part or some kind of a conceptual background that Whitehead always tries to include, and his own position. So the conceptual schemas that he's really stands behind or tries to develop. And I think this chapter especially does have this kind of two-parted structure, or at least I try to isolate some of the historical parts in the beginning, and then move to more like substantial philosophical parts in the end. So I think this should help a little bit in trying to understand what he's trying to get at. So yeah, to begin with this historical part, we're simply thrown like into the developments of intellectual developments of the 17th century, how science and philosophy interacted. And Whitehead doesn't really begin with defining the term philosophy; he just starts using it in like a conventional sense. And I think this is very much intentional and even useful, because what Whitehead is trying to say, what he's trying to get across, is that our common conception of philosophy, and even the way we differentiate it from science, is a product of a particular, particularly modern mode of thought. So precisely the kind of the intellectual structure that he's trying to disentangle within this book. So yeah, the main idea is like the encapsulated in this citation, like the origin of modern philosophy is analogous to that of science and is contemporaneous. So what he's trying to say is that science and philosophy, at least in this context, are basically two parts, two aspects of the same process, of the same movement of thought. And not only that, but the chasm between the two is actually indicative of some problematic chasm within this mode of thought as such. So this will be his approach, trying to critique, trying to see what early modern philosophy has to say about this more general style of thought, and to work out a critique through this historical analysis. And this may be an exception to point out is German classical philosophy, and there are of course others to be found, where he simply has no way of really including them into his historical schema. So this is something like we could maybe discuss later. Okay, but to return to his line of thought. So the main characteristic of the 17th century, of the whole, like, let's say, intellectual climate, is this is huge inspiration from classical antiquity. So a kind of break from a medieval theological centered thought. And where the philosophy and science of the early modern period really divide is a question of, on the question of objectivism versus subjectivism. So this is something like where modern philosophy breaks not only from its medieval heritage, but also from classical antiquity. It's like antique philosophy, the way Whitehead generalizes it, is very much objectivist. It's interested in objective, let's say, third-person phenomena, whereas modern philosophy, that the basic orientation is subjectivist. So before we even get to what this dichotomy really is, the subject or objectivity divide really is about, we could say something about the deeper reasons for this divide, because there is a more fundamental, I think, motivation for why modern philosophy is attracted to the subjective pole. And this is because, as Whitehead says, philosophy is always a rationalist, at least in the sense that rationalism. Well, here actually it gets a little bit strange, because Whitehead says describes this rationality very classically in terms of like rationalists want to get behind the phenomena, want to have some sort of general or universal principles for the unfolding of phenomena. And this is strange because it seems like what this is precisely what science is doing, right? It's also modern science is articulating some general principles behind the flux of nature. And so this is something that was puzzling for me. And the way I try to read this, this is my own interpretation, is that there is a deeper sense of rationalism for Whitehead. Not only is it about universals or laws, but it's about the interrelationship between our most fundamental categories of thought. So for science, a basic characteristic of modern science, what Whitehead says is it's anti-rationalism, is the way it still externally relates the basic categories of, let's say, matter, space, time, and so on. These terms are not really transparent for each other. There is no inherent logic that relates these terms. They're just there, and they seem to be useful for observing phenomena. Whereas for philosophy, wants to have like a single principle which orients the entire conceptual schema which one has. And in this sense, like Whitehead can say that even time, matter, space, and even laws of movement remain stubborn facts for science, for modern science. And in this sense, like this is because the ultimate cause of the divide for Whitehead is that in the 17th century, there began a movement of thought which related scientific objectivity with precisely this kind of external and static relations that science operated with. And it is because of this that philosophy is pushed into a speculation, into subjective phraseology, like it has into this domain of subjective individual experience rather than intersubjective reality. Okay, so just to quickly pass over the centuries, like this is something that is characteristic for Whitehead, mostly through the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. The most like general or the best way this is exemplified is in Descartes' philosophy, in his dualism of matter and mind as the two basic substances. Of course, we can see why like this. We have matter as science, as naturally science understands it on one side, and the mind as a philosopher, as an epistemologist would approach it on the other. But it is not tied to essentially dualist positions. What is even more characteristic for this intellectual framework is the specific division of labor, which is still not present in Descartes. This is like, and this division is that science studies the material world, whereas philosophy studies the subjective mind. Or we could also say that philosophy becomes specifically specialized in epistemology. So this would be like a line of thought going from Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, and so on. So, and even maybe perhaps a more fundamental key to this division of labor is that we have a division between, or I should say, that the physical framework is bound to the objective realm, while the mental vocabulary or the framework of our mental notions of mentality remain bound to the subjective realm. So you could say that physics describe what is in itself and what is intersubjectively given, and psychology and philosophy describe what is for itself and privately given. And this is not a stable position. Like this is, we can see throughout the history of philosophy that this led to all sorts of entanglements. And as Whitehead says, it remains coherent only as long as one limits itself to this artificial partitioning of points of view. And even as such, it remains kind of stuck in this some fundamental aporias. So let me just go through the two fundamental aporias, which are, of course, something we all have encountered before. So this is the first one is like Whitehead says that we experience a seamless interconnection between the mental and the physical aspects of reality. So of course, like we see colored objects and do not start by having these two clear-cut domains of experience, right? And modern methodology, he says, cuts straight across this flux of nature. So we could say we could recognize here like the basic mind-body problem, as it's nowadays phrased. And the second related problem, is that the two terms are not symmetric. So matter is, in some ways, matter is inherent to the mind. If we think of a mind as intentional, as having as being fundamentally about the objects of thought, then matter as that which is thought about is what's the word, becomes inherent to the mind. So it's not something that's external. It's not even something. It doesn't even. It could very well not even be real. So this is like the basic problem of solipsism. So the most fundamental problem of this whole period of thought becomes how a self-enclosed mind comes to know something like an external material reality, or if there even is any such independently objective reality to speak of. Okay, so here I will depart from this historical overview of let's say the problem which is a kind of point of departure for Whitehead, and go into the 20th century solutions. So here, solutions to this problem. So here, Whitehead, of course, also mentions other authors, the most important of which are Bergson and James. But I think most of the arguments proposed in this part of the chapter are actually his own. Someone can correct me on that, but I think this is pretty much his, more or less his own original position. So the key problem with the whole framework that was presented earlier has to do with the notion of substance. So here he returns to Descartes and says that the fundamental mistake that Descartes made was to try to formalize thinking beings on the grounds of notions of substantiality, and this. Let me just note this. So this is the substance, and here understood like as that which is in need of nothing beyond itself in order to exist, and on the like let's say logical from the logical point of view, it is a carrier of predications. So you can see here like this is not only you could say the origin of the notion of like a matter in a simple location, but also of a mind as a kind of a self-enclosed or all-encompassing monad, right? So the subject here, if it is interpreted as a kind of a substance, then then the object can only be interpreted as a kind of static determination wholly internal to the subject. So in this sense, the logical conclusion of this framework would be idealism. So the absolutization of subjectivity. And this is again, this is my my addition would be like, it would be interesting to discuss some traditions which go beyond, or at least escape this kind of this critique. Especially German idealism, of course, isn't really, even in its absolute idealism of Hegel, isn't really bound, or isn't. I don't think the critique really applies, because the notion of substance is the very object of critique for the, I think, for the whole movement. So yeah, we could maybe discuss this later. But anyway, what is interesting for Whitehead is not just any kind of critique of substantiality, but specifically the one which is which comes to the fore in the 20th century, where the subject-object distinction begins, so to say, to erode from both sides. So, in the sense that the science, that the criticism of substantiality comes both from the scientific and philosophical side, and that these two sides themselves become the distinction between the two sides becomes is something to be people strive to abandon this distinction. So the in this respect, physiology is the most important of the disciplines, precisely because we can see that that the distinction between like that the partitioning no longer works. So we are trying to consider the mind as an objective event, and on the other hand, we are trying to see physical occurrences as constitutive of cognition. So in this sense, James is very interesting for Whitehead, because he denies, he starts from these presuppositions, and he arrives at the conclusion that the consciousness isn't a thing or a substance. And the way, but what consciousness actually is, I think, is a wholly Whiteheadian idea here. Or in this chapter, I think there is some confusion, at least for me, whether he is presenting Jamesian position or he is developing his own. But anyway, I think that from here on out, the position is pretty much wholly Whiteheadian. So here the notion, and so the what would be the alternative to seeing consciousness as a thing? He says, like, we could start from from the chemical compositions which make up like a biological organism, and one of the crucial observations is that the parts are in such interrelations as to preserve the whole. So and in this sense, so there is a kind of, there is a whole to be spoken of, independent, or at least something, yeah, that is different from the parts, and that the parts are somehow subordinated to that whole. And cognition here could be interpreted as, here I quote him, as a reflective experience of a totality, reporting for itself, for itself what it is in itself as one unit of occurrence. So, and here one could raise the question, this is my question, like, why is this not solipsistic? Why are we not back at the solipsistic self-consciousness? And I think he does provide a very good answer, although it is quite entangled and long. But anyway, yeah, it is because the unity, the specific unity of consciousness, as Whitehead sees it is a unity of an event, of his notion of event, or I could also say it's a unity of principles of organizations, or organization for a stable and enduring pattern. So one could say that the biological organism is constituted from parts, which are, of course, on the first glance, we could say that the constitutive parts of the organism are parts of its body, right? So, and he does say like that the parts of the organism's bodies could be defined as those parts that are especially sensitive to modification of each other and subordinated to the larger, to the organizing of a larger pattern that is the whole body, right? But there's more to this position. Namely, the pattern of the individual body cannot exist outside of the interactions of the patterns of the whole environment. So this is I think this is what he means by the total bodily event. So like the entire environment of possible interactions for an individual. So in this sense, we could say, I mean, it's obvious what he means. Like any kind of organism has to feed, has to maintain its bodily functions by interacting with all sorts of things, so as not to be in danger or die. And in this sense, the difference between the individual body of the environment and the environment itself is individual body of the organism and the environment is not actually sharply drawn for Whitehead, because all these interactions are what ultimately leads to a stabilization of a pattern that we could identify as an individual organism. So you could say that it is that the distinction between the organism itself and its environment is a matter of a more or less tight-knit, or a degree of tightness of mutual dependence of parts. And this is the ultimate reason why we are able to cognize beyond ourselves. This is like, let me quote him, like, we know ourselves as a function of the unification of a plurality of things other than ourselves. So in this sense, yet there is a kind of individuality of enduring pattern that is your own body, but your consciousness is actually of a unity that that stands for the totality of possible interactions within which this pattern establishes itself as stable, let's say, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, because the total bodily event is relevant for some particular enduring pattern, the pattern is reflected in its environment. And so here I would, I guess, end this discussion of this problem and just add one thing, a thing I found really interesting, like an addition that isn't really explored in the chapter, where he says like the cognition, like we could, I guess his main line of argument is that the cognition could be understood as a prehension of an individual organism or an event so the way an event prehends other events, so a cognizing organism prehends cognitively its environment, right? But there's also a flip side where you could say that cognition also involves being prehended by higher cognitive agents. So this is, I think, implied where he says we can detect in ourselves direct aspects of the mentalities of other organisms. And this is something I think it's quite interesting, but I cannot really grasp it or find any good examples. So maybe this is something we can discuss later. And now let me just quickly recap and pose some questions for the debate. So yeah. Oh, yeah, and the one other thing is, yeah, that we through the we could also start, like, I basically stuck to his notion of physiology and the way he tries to articulate the notion of the organism from the example of the biological sciences, but one could also start from the inanimate nature and the physical approach, which he does, which he also tries to do in the chapter, but that part was especially dense, and I couldn't really grasp what he was trying to say there, so we can return to that in the discussion. But anyway, so I think the basic point of this whole chapter is that thought and matter are better grasped as essential aspects of individual organisms. So they cannot really be they cannot be separated substantially, or even any sort of methodological partitioning leads to an abstraction. So, and this is something like, I mean, it leads to an interesting kind of, one could say, panpsychism, right? So I think this doesn't lead us to the conclusion that, like you said, that an electron literally thinks or is conscious, but I think it does imply that human thought is to be construed as a mode of prehension and the attainment of a stability of a pattern of our own existence. And this is, I think, quite a crucial shift for Whitehead, for Whiteheadian epistemology. And from here, I think one can ask all sorts of questions. Like the most general maybe could be like, what are the different kinds of prehension and attainment of stability? Like, I think I don't know if Whitehead ever tried to systematically differentiate between different modes of prehension, but there seems to be a lot to be said for, I don't know. I mean, if you try to, if you are attentive to the similarities between, like, say, the way an electron prehends its environment and the way a human does, I think it would be equally productive to point out the most basic kind of differences, or differences in level or complexity, or anything like that. So, so are there like categories one could point out, like physical, biological, mental, or something like that, kinds of prehension? And then another question I had is, like, do all of them involve some level of reflection? Here, I think he introduces the interesting notion of reflection, of the way the whole is given to itself. And this is something like, I'm interested to know whether this is something he, which is crucial to his framework of events in prehension. Like, are all events somehow given to themselves, or is it?
Well, that was a great summary and overview, Timotej. And I guess one place I'd like to inquire more into with you all is what Whitehead says in regard to German idealism. And he mentions it 2 or 3 times in the chapter. He closes the chapter by saying that what the German idealist movement accomplished in the domains of ethics and aesthetics needs in the next century to be integrated with contemporary science. But I don't get the sense that he was very familiar with the primary texts of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. I know he was surrounded by British idealists who were mostly Hegelian, but I get the sense that he did not realize the extent to which Schelling in particular was really immersed in the science of his day, and in fact arrived at a conception of nature as organic, very much in line with Whitehead's own account. And so it strikes me as like a missed opportunity for him, despite his tendency to kind of dwell in the history of modern philosophy. He unfortunately didn't, he was mostly looking at Kant and then a bit of Leibniz, but it didn't spend much time with the other post-Kantian idealists. And I think that's unfortunate because he might have gotten a leg up on his own project, you know, with some of the work that Schelling had already done. And are any of you familiar with Schelling's philosophy of nature a little bit? I mean, you know, in short, Schelling takes some hints from Kant's critique of judgment and tries to show how, you know, if we can have, if artistic genius can sort of tap into the formative power of nature, then why can't we have scientific genius that can grasp organism as constitutive of nature, right? Kant wouldn't allow that. But Schelling makes the case that no, we can, in fact, know nature as organic through and through. And, you know, this was without the aid of electromagnetism and quantum theory that Whitehead was able to build on in the 20th century. Some have argued that Schelling actually helped Faraday and Maxwell like connect electricity and magnetism. You know, they did the mathematical heavy lifting, but and experimental work, but Schelling sort of brought the concepts of electricity and magnetism into a polarity that was highly suggestive. But in any event, I just felt like it was a missed opportunity on Whitehead's part, not recognizing the continuity of his philosophy of organism with Schelling's work. Schelling's kind of an atypical idealist in that, you know, he really tried to do justice to nature in a way that, to the reality of nature and the life of nature in a way that I guess especially Fichte didn't acknowledge. But I think even more so than Hegel, Schelling really makes nature, puts nature at the center and the core of his philosophizing, whereas Hegel had a more spiritual bent, let's say. But yeah, I mean, I just wanted to bring that point in because a lot of my work now is trying to tease out these connections, conceptual resonances between Schelling and Whitehead. And I hadn't read this chapter in a while, and it just struck me that he really overlooked that, the work that Schelling had already done.
I mean, I think, yeah, it's his whole canonizing of Western philosophy is very, very limited, actually. Like, he says that this is something encapsulating like the 3 centuries of philosophizing, and I guess this, I mean, even like to take into account thinkers like Nietzsche, perhaps, or Schopenhauer and people like that, I think would be, I mean, especially in regards to Nietzsche, I think it would be very productive. But there are also a whole plethora of other authors that seem to, if not lend themselves, at least are not very apt to be incorporated in this schema of like it's naturalistic philosophy on one side, or what we could call it like 17th century philosophy on one side, and then philosophy of the organism on the other.
I think Whitehead did end up reading Nietzsche later after this book was written. I think one of his students, I think it was Charles Hartshorne, gave him a copy of Will to Power, and Whitehead, his copy of it is preserved and it's all marked up, and he seems to have really appreciated that notion and felt aligned with it. You know, this is a work where Nietzsche is talking about reality as being composed of these like centers of force, almost like I guess it's sometimes called perspectivalism, like each center of force brings forth its own perspective. It's very much in line with what Whitehead's articulating here. But he doesn't write much about Nietzsche. I don't think he felt comfortable because he just, he probably only read a dozen pages or so. Timothy, you'd raised this question about whether Whitehead's account of the psychological field still can be critiqued as somewhat solipsistic, and how he gets out of that. I thought you addressed that well, but there was this point he makes on what page is this? 150, where he says right at the bottom, we must allow for the possibility that we can detect in ourselves direct aspects of the mentalities of higher organisms. The claim that the cognition of alien mentalities must necessarily be by means of indirect inferences from aspects of shape and of sense objects is wholly unwarranted by his own philosophy of organism. What he's suggesting here, in Process and Reality, he'll just admit that his philosophy of organism implies a kind of telepathy. In other words, there's internal relationships among actual entities, such that, elsewhere he'll talk about feelings of sympathy. And I think telepathy is more of a charged word. Sympathy, we can understand, I think without too much of a stretch, that, he's talking about, for example, the way we can, the way we interact with dogs, we can feel what they're feeling, and we know that they have emotional states. It's more obvious in the case of human beings. So I think what he's trying to resist is this more Cartesian understanding of, I guess, what nowadays psychologists or cognitive scientists would call a theory of mind, as if we have to build up via inference from sensory perceptions what another person might be feeling. And I think there is some degree of, that going on sort of in a second order way in our reflection. We can refine what we initially experience as sympathy in a more cognitive way, but that Whitehead's point is that the basis of any reflective theory of mind is going to be these feelings of sympathy, whereby we are in direct contact with the interior states of the organisms in our environment, and that through a process of prehension, we're literally incorporating aspects of the organisms in our environment, incorporating even their subjective experiences as they perish and are transmitted to us into our own subjective experience. And so that there's no solipsism in his scheme, because we're literally, each moment of our own experience is made of the transmitted or perished feelings transmitted to us from the organisms in our environment. And so I think this is one of the more potentially radical claims that he's making, that really refigures, our understanding of how human consciousness relates to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess, and it's all, I think what's radical is that it's grounded in a different conception of what consciousness is, or what its function is. Like, let's say the basic distinction, as I see it, is that cognitive science still proceeds usually in a very kind of representational terms. Like, when you want to understand somebody, you want to represent in your own head what he or she is thinking, or somehow grasp some aspects of their mind, right? Whereas he tries to understand, I think, individual consciousness as a kind of structure of self-preservation or self unfolding. And then relationships to others are also thought in terms of the way our interactions help or diminish our capacities for self-structurations. And in this sense, I think it gets very interesting for me. I find this very close to me, this notion. But I also see some problems in Whitehead. Namely, this is what I wanted to say, but I think I didn't take enough time to explain it, is that I think the problem is that you still have this dual notion of, I mean, prehension is a kind of what's the word, relational notion, and it's asymmetric in the sense that what I prehend, I always prehend as a kind of larger top-down unity, and I prehend parts of my, say, like prehend pieces of my being, of what constitutes my individual stability, let's say. So I can prehend others as a kind of let's say, not tools, but means of achieving my own stability. Or you could turn this the other way around, which I think he does in this very sentence that you mentioned, Matt, where he says that you can be prehended by a higher kind of mentality, in the sense that you can only be a part of a higher mentality, or you can prehend lower mentalities, or let's say patterns. And what I'm asking, and what I'm interested in is, can we approach through this framework a kind of democratic, let's say, relationship, like, or say horizontal relationships between different patterns or events or beings, which aren't, let's say, non like symmetrical relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think when he's trying to describe the relationships of prehension among the parts of an animal organism's body, he does, he speaks in terms of like the transmission of series of modifications that descend from the whole to the parts. But I think he sees, I mean, there are these sorts of hierarchies of feeling in nature. Otherwise, we wouldn't have unity of experience, he thinks. There needs to be a process whereby a diversity of prehensions are brought under contrast and gradually achieve some sense of aesthetic unity. In later books, he'll call it in a dominant monad, kind of drawing on Leibniz a bit. But he also talks about the plant realm, which is organized differently. He says animal bodies are organized like monarchies and plant bodies are organized like democracies. And I think the animal form of organization is relatively rare in nature. And, he'll say things like, in Process and Reality, he says, we find ourselves in a buzzing world amidst a democracy of fellow creatures. And by creatures, he means his actual occasions of experience. And so it's almost like the foundational level is this democratic relationship among prehensive unifications, but part of the evolutionary process and its movement towards greater complexity is, to develop these hierarchies of feeling, which is what culminates in consciousness and cognition, which, for Whitehead, most experience is not cognitive. Most experience isn't a matter of knowledge. There's nothing that you don't need. Experience doesn't need to be known in order to occur, right? Consciousness is this function of knowing experience. And he thinks that does require this hierarchy of feeling whereby some unity or whole is achieved that has in that way diminished the importance of the parts, but the parts serve the achievement of that whole or that unity. So yeah, there's hierarchy and democracy.
Yeah, go ahead, Miha. I was actually reminded when you mentioned, Matt, this notion of telepathy and what's the other thing? Not telepathy, but
Sympathy.
sympathy. Yes, sympathy. I'm always going back to Alexander because I'm, I guess, a bit fascinated by him as of late, and it's interesting how Alexander is pondering this question of cognition, right? He is trying to base it primarily as a relation like any other, like a relation of a chair to the table, really. The only caveat, I suppose, is that we are enmeshed in this special kind of relation, right? We are cognizing about something. So it's not like we can just look at a relation of a chair next to a table. We can also experience this relation. This is the bonus here, right, of this cognizing relation. And it's interesting how he frames it. He frames it as a kind of togetherness. And it's really weird how he's speaking of it. He says, if I'm watching a horse, right, I am cognizing the horse and the horse is together with me. He literally says it like that. And this togetherness amounts to, and it's so fascinating, the word he uses. He says, the horse is compressant with myself as the enjoying, cognizing, I guess, being, right, which is just amazing because, well, Whitehead uses the notion of concrescence, really, so it's just such a similar sounding word in itself already, but not just similarly sounding, but it actually signifies something very similar, right? This togetherness, right? Yeah, I guess this is what I'm always reminded of, I guess, when I guess try to understand his notion of, I guess, relations, right? This togetherness, because it's such a weird thing because you don't usually think of it in these terms. That when I'm cognizing something, I am together with that thing, which is such an interesting notion.
Yeah, just this is what this conception of cognition follows, from his critique of substance, whereas we would in a substance ontology, if we were to ask, where is the sun, which is an example he uses, well, it's over there and it's separate from us and we maybe sense its effects upon us. But Whitehead's actually saying, well, the sun or any thing, what we would usually tend to call or think of as a substance, is wherever its activity extends. And so the activity of the sun is with us. We feel it because it is partaking in us and we are partaking in it. I don't know that the sun feels us as importantly in its experience as we feel it, but nonetheless, there's a mutual relationship there. And, certainly the earth as a whole has an influence on the sun. A slight wobble, in the sun can be detected as a result of the earth and the other planets, but we're in a way inside the sun. And the sun is in a way inside of us, right? This is kind of what he gets into in that earlier chapter. Was it the 18th century when he talks about Bishop Berkeley's understanding of space and, how where he develops his conception of prehension. And so there's this mutual sort of indwelling of the various entities in nature through this prehensive relationship.
I would actually just add, since we mentioned already this, I guess, German idealist tradition, and you're interested, I think, as you pointed out, in Schelling, right, and Goethe as well. Actually, funny enough, there's another Alexander who I guess I'm interested in here, right? It's Alexander von Humboldt, who's who was, I guess, one of those pioneers and who really put forth this notion of an interconnected environment, right? And it's funny enough because he was also really in touch with Goethe at the period of his life, of Goethe's life, where he was writing, or he's starting to write, I think, what's the book on plants?
Metamorphosis of Plants.
Metamorphosis of Plants. Again, another very interesting character, right? Really, I guess, a pioneer in this notion of interconnectivity, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Humboldt was one of Darwin says one of his most important influences. Darwin wouldn't have gone on his trip on the Beagle unless he had read Humboldt's account of traveling to South America. And that whole organic, what we would call now ecological awareness that Humboldt had was very much shaping Darwin's imagination. And yet, well, just to say that, I think Darwin in the more predominant conception of evolutionary biology nowadays is lacking this awareness of the lineage here, that there's actually, and there's a scholar, Robert Richards, who's written a lot about this, the romantic Darwin, basically, and that this romantic conception of nature was very present in Darwin's work, and that's just been kind of lost and forgotten by the emphasis on more reductionistic methods and molecular biology and the mechanistic conception of nature. So I think pulling on these threads again that connect Darwin back to Humboldt and Goethe and Schelling would reveal a totally different I guess alternative history we could tell of the emergence of biology and evolutionary theory. Whitehead does put a lot of weight on William James's philosophy as inaugurating this new epoch. And I think maybe at Harvard, a decade after James had died, when Whitehead got there and was teaching, it might have seemed like, oh yes, this will be the Jamesian century, but it didn't pan out that way. And I can think of different reasons why. Just the rise of analytic philosophy and the effect of the world wars, and kind of leading to this hesitance to engage in a kind of speculative philosophy, the rise of science, and the impact of, one of the turning points that's often pointed to by historians is Bergson's debate and arguments with Einstein, that this really shaped the public understanding of the relationship between science and philosophy. And because Bergson seems to have made a few scientific mistakes, philosophers were worried, in the wake of that encounter between Bergson and Einstein, that, well, we better just sort of toe the line for science, or we'll risk being dismissed as, merely, artists or psychologists or what have you, as Bergson was by some. But I wonder what you all think about this. Whitehead seems to have, maybe he was a century early, and in the 21st century, we'll look back and say, yes, we should have followed the Jamesian route and the Whiteheadian route. But so far, 100 years after Whitehead, that's not at all how things have unfolded. think Deleuze helped generate more interest in Bergson again, but James, I don't know how he's received in Europe, but even in America, he's not discussed as much as I'd like to see by philosophers.
Never read a single work by James.
I mean, personally, I'm just familiar with James through Whitehead, so that's not a fair argument, I guess, to make really from my part. What at least I found interesting is that both Whitehead, William James, and Bergson were interested. I mean, were partially referencing all of them more or less Zenon's paradox. I know there's this similarity between the three, right? They're really interested. James is very interested in his what is it again? Spacious present, right? He's working this notion out. Bergson is really interested in time, for instance, right? In Whitehead is, I guess, kind of, maybe it's too much to phrase it this way, but I guess trying to marry the two, I suppose, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of aspect of temporality which Whitehead really wants to take seriously, right? He doesn't want to, I guess, dissolve causality, right, into being a mere non-concept as Hume did, for instance. And he also wants to, I guess, preserve a kind of reality for, I guess, this present moment as well, right? So again, it does not, I guess, disappear into just being an infinite series of possible divisions of, I guess, a time period or something. And again, Alexander is doing basically something similar as well. He uses actually the phrase, "we must take time seriously," right? So I guess there's this aspect of temporality, or causality, I suppose, that I guess is tying them. I mean, it's one of many, I guess, threads that is connecting them, at least as far as my understanding of these thinkers goes. But as far as the reception of William James, I guess, at least in our faculty, I mean, I'm speaking for myself here, but he's not really mentioned that much. Maybe I think we mentioned him a bit in cognitive philosophy or something that we have. Timotej, I think maybe you know Markic. He mentions.
He was mentioned, but he wasn't on the reading list.
He is partially mentioned, so that we know that he existed, I suppose.
Yeah, he's usually mentioned in relation to his theory of emotions in cognitive science. Yeah, we treated that, but that's basically it. We never really dealt with his whole psychological system. Yeah.
But to respond to your, more broadly to your question, like, is the 21st century going to be Whiteheadian? I was thinking perhaps at least in line of like cognitive science development. It seems that perhaps it could be, right? I mean, if you trace like the paradigmatic shifts, we've gone from very like hard-boiled representationalist realism to an activism. It seems at least it seems to be like almost the predominant frame of thought in cognitive sciences, and maybe like predictive processing, I think also has some similarities to this kind of approach. Actually, I was greatly reminded of Goldstein when I was doing some predictive processing texts. But anyway, what I was thinking about was maybe precisely that. What a shame! For me, it seems almost a kind of shame that a pity that that enactivism in Varela's thinking came so heavily to rely on phenomenology. I think this was like, at least in my opinion, it was a misstep, and it would benefit much more greatly by authors such as perhaps Whitehead or like maybe Deleuze even, or people who were more in line with the kind of transcending of the subject-object dualism, not trying to ground the research again on some kind of fundamental being, such as Husserl, let's say, transcendental subject. It could be debated, it could be argued like that Merleau-Ponty's philosophy goes beyond this. But still, I think there are authors such as Whitehead, I think, offer a very great, are very much in line and perhaps go further in this direction that I think enactivism always wanted to go.
Yeah, I totally agree 100%. There's a paper that Varela wrote with Andreas Weber. I think it was his last paper. It was published in 2002, Life After Kant. And it begins with a quote from Whitehead. And they sort of develop a notion of what they call the subject pole, which is very Whiteheadian. And but still in that paper, it's as close as Varela comes, I think, to a fully organic conception of nature as a whole, but they still stop at the cell and say that the cell bootstraps itself out of the realm of neutral physics and chemistry and establishes a center of concern or a subject pole. So it's not fully Whiteheadian. It's not panpsychist, it's biopsychist, I would say. And, you know, I've been, more than 10 years kind of poking Evan Thompson to get him to read more Whitehead. And I won't take full credit, but he has, and I'm really excited to see how the whole inactive approach to cog side develops now. His new book that's going to be coming out that he's co-authored on the blind spot apparently is drawing a lot on Whitehead. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the marriage of a kind of Whiteheadian ontology with the inactive and autopoetic approach, you know, in the life sciences and the cognitive sciences. You know, I'm excited to see how those two come together. Because you're right, if we're limited to this phenomenological approach, then it's almost like a form of idealism, rather than this provisional realism that Whitehead is trying to articulate. And I think the philosophy of organism Whitehead articulates provides, it's almost seamless, like the perfect ontology for the inactive approach to cognitive science. Or you could say it puts this autopoetic biology and inactive cognitive science in a cosmological context that really enhances a sense of continuity of all the levels of nature. So I'm very excited by this turn that Evan's work has taken more towards Whitehead.
It's interesting that both you said about Whitehead that it's a shame that he didn't know the German idealist tradition better and didn't refer to it more. And you have this similar phenomenon with Varela. He knew certain thinkers very well and constantly referred to them, was constantly inspired by them, whereas he seemed to have been completely oblivious of a whole host of thinkers who had been kind of tangential to the things similar to what he was saying. He simply never mentioned and never really referred to it. And I wonder, what is this really symptomatic of? Is it maybe their training, which maybe wasn't so much in this history philosophy tradition, or is it perhaps the way philosophy had started to be done by already the 20th century, where it's more problem-centric? We have these problems, and now we sort of have to figure out a solution to them. And this historical perspective of being aware of what the people before us said, is kind of being relegated to the as an antiquity, and maybe this is something that has started to lack in the way philosophy is being done. This and not just philosophy. I think humanities in general. And even science, this historical perspective of being aware, what are we grounded in, what has been said before, and to be able, because I think that's where most of the great ideas seem to come from, when someone discovers some old thought and then juxtaposes it with something new, and then you have this interesting fusion which enables jump forward. And maybe this is a little we are doing ourselves a disservice by neglecting this historical perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think Whitehead and Varela are similar in the sense that they both came out of the sciences. And yeah, like you said, they didn't have historical training in the history of philosophy. But, you know, I guess it makes me feel better for not having read all the great thinkers that, you know, some of you are mentioning. There's just not enough time in the day, you know, but yeah, just because they're coming out of the science, they're the type of scientists, I guess Whitehead more mathematician initially, that they're, rather than dismissing philosophy as irrelevant, they recognized how significant philosophy is in shaping the imaginative background of different periods of history. And you know, the question was raised, like, in Whitehead's new view of the universe and of, you know, science and philosophy, how do we distinguish between them? And it seems to me that it becomes a matter of just the specific and the general. There's more continuity. Science deals with specific problems. It develops specific jargons and research methodologies and paradigms, experiments, and specializes, right? And Whitehead wants to, in a way, by establishing this new role for philosophy as the critic of abstractions of the special sciences, seeking the general harmonization of all the special. Yeah, well, I was just saying, it feels like Whitehead wanted to liberate the special sciences to pursue their research without having to worry about philosophy, but he also wanted to raise the importance of the work of philosophers to bring all the special abstractions of the sciences into some general harmony. And so there's a continuity, there's no like sharp break between philosophy and science. It's just more a matter of where on the continuum between specialization and generalization you fall. It seems to me that that's the new relationship he sees between science and philosophy.
That's the thing that fascinates me. How do we do this work of harmonizing? What does it actually mean in practice? In a way, yes, let's build up the theoretical fundaments that sort of, I don't know, for example, in the case of mind-body, that connect the physical sciences with the psychological sciences. That's one way, but what does it mean in terms of creating a perspective of all the knowledge we're gathering, both in the natural sciences and the humanities and everything? How do we approach this? What does it mean to harmonize the different kinds of knowledge we're accumulating through time? Because you said there's not enough time to read everything, and I think that's going to become an increasingly great problem in every field, and especially in philosophy. There are I think Sebastian is constantly tweeting about it, retweeting articles about how there are too many academic articles being produced constantly, and there's just this mass of articles that nobody can really keep track of. And I wonder, how could we apply what Whitehead is saying to sort of trying to bring order into this mess, into this increasing in this vortex of the academia, because on the one hand, I guess the ultimate question becomes, what are we really trying to do in our pursuits? Why would we want to harmonize? What was the end goal that we want to improve our tools so we can approach it better? And I'm not sure that's clear, because like we're captured in our particular fields. Someone is dealing with the mind-body problem, someone's dealing with the cosmology, I don't know. But to what end? Like, if we want to put this together, to put a perspective, I guess we have to know what perspective are we standing on, and where are we heading? Yeah.
I would just add a bit of an aside, I guess. I mean, it's related to what you said, Primož. When I'm, I guess, reading Whitehead's interpretations of the history of thought and so on, I'm always, I guess, more reminded to what Isabel Stengers pointed out in her book, Thinking with Whitehead, where she calls out Whitehead's attitude here when she labels him as a kind of Cavalier thinker, right? Which is really, I guess, in line with what one would think of under this notion of speculative thought, I suppose, right? This, what for me, I guess, Whitehead represents, and I guess more recently I've found this more directly explicated by, I think, what's his name again? Rupert Sheldrake, right? He's always emphasizing this notion of that science should be this free, imaginative, and speculative, right? That these are, I guess, important notions even in science, right? Not just philosophy. And Whitehead, I guess, when he's talking about the history of thought or whatever, right? He's just picking and choosing, which specifically in this chapter, I think is also quite prominent when he's speaking of Descartes, right? He is in a way subverting him, right? There is not this simply located, there isn't this notion of simple locality of, I guess, the cognizing substance or the material substance or whatever, right? There is a, I suppose, if we really want to understand it, right, there we should, well, I guess that, so he's subverting Descartes in a way that he's discarding parts of his dualism, but still retaining, I guess, this notion of individuality, for instance. And then he's taking Locke's notions and running with Locke's notions, which I guess your typical Lockean scholar never would really, right? He would not start from a kind of organic Lockean philosophy, right? Whatever that is. For Whitehead, that is a thing. So he takes it, runs with it, and the speculation continues, I suppose. So he's really not concerned in this, I guess, typical scholarly way of really categorizing all this mass of different views, which are, well, even more, I guess, absurd, I guess, in quantity today as they were in Whitehead's time. Yeah, I guess, if that helps.
Maybe if I could add something, this is from the top of my head, but when I was reading Whitehead and listening to these recordings, I got the feeling that Whitehead has some kind of theory of everything for philosophy. Like, his approach really reminded me to, for example, Wolfram theory of everything in physics. Or I just got the feeling that, for example, his approach to philosophy is subsuming all the other philosophical schools or theories under his own kind of paradigm or his own kind of stipulation of what philosophy actually is. And because he's, of course, a mathematician, and his approach is in a way really materialistic, as the way I get it, or it's in a way how nature constructs itself and how nature is tracking this kind of patterns that produce this kind of events. It's just really interesting to see how, yeah, it's just interesting to see how powerful Whitehead is and how hard it is to go against what he's saying, I would say, or at least this was my impression when reading him. And that's why I also mentioned how he's subsuming different perspectives under him. And maybe one additional thing, the link I posted in our thread on Gmail, where this German philosopher, sociologist, and cognitive archaeologist also has this kind of very radically materialistic approach to philosophy of technology. So he is basically trying to understand how different cultures could be thought in through this technological framework of problem solution distance. And then through this approach and through this concept of through this concept, we can get cognigrams of different cultures or different groups and then civilizations, which follow a kind of recursive pattern, what he calls process emulative recursion. And I again see how Whitehead philosophy is directly related to what he's saying. And for example, this theorist Davor Loeffler also talks about Platonic processual forms and how there are these universal patterns that we encounter through this new and new bootstrapping from like one picture to another or whatever. I know that this is not perfect language for how he would describe it, but yeah, I just want to share what my impression is.
Yeah, thanks for that. I am not familiar with his work, but the connections you're drawing are intriguing. You know, so I'll have to follow that up. But this notion of recurring patterns, as processual Platonic forms is how he refers to them. It's very interesting.
Yeah. And the other concept is process emulative recursion.
Emulative recursion, yeah.
So basically, it's like if we go through, I don't know how weapons developed, humans or develop a sphere, and then after, I don't know, a couple of thousand years, they develop a bow, which already contains within it the mechanism of a spear, but it's produced through different kind of technology. Yeah, it's integrated in a new manner, in a new way, and yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. I have to run in a moment for another meeting, but just on this question of what Whitehead, what this would look like in practice, this new relationship between philosophy and science. I mean, I think about the difference between cosmology as, Plato and Aristotle understood it, where there was no bifurcation of nature. There was no split between subject and object, fact and value, purpose and mechanism. Like these modern dualisms did not exist. And so the cosmos was whole, and our conception of, their conception of order was truly universal, right? There wasn't an order of the mind and an order of nature. I know Kant kind of complicates that a bit, but what Whitehead's really trying to do is restore a sense of a more ancient sense of cosmology as an understanding of the universe that would include not just the scientific picture, but also our aesthetic intuitions, our religious and spiritual values, in particular religious experience. Whitehead's not very interested in religious doctrine. He's more interested in experience. And this is coming from William James, right? Maybe his most famous book, The Variety of Religious Experience, was very important for Whitehead. And so what Whitehead's trying to do is restore our sense of, I don't know what to call it, holistic cosmology, where it's not just physics and astrophysics. And if we were going to pursue a theory of everything, it would need to include more than the equations of physics, because everything would seem to also imply our human consciousness and all the things that we are cognizant of in nature that goes beyond just the measurements and calculations that physicists make. Whitehead took those measurements and calculations very seriously, right? But he thought there was more to nature than that. And so, his real aim, I think, was a civilizational one. He wanted to influence and provoke the emergence of a planetary civilization, which would incorporate the knowledge of science that has been won over the last few centuries, but that would not dismiss the so-called subjective aspects of reality in the way that many modern physicists have. And so he's seeking integration in service of a new mode of civilization, because he was worried that this old form of mechanistic science was undermining. He's very prescient. We'll see later in this book about the damage being done to the ecosystems of the earth as a result of this overly abstract conception of nature coming out of mechanistic science. And so, the takeaway is, I think, if we had a Whiteheadian approach to these issues, we would be more concerned to track the relationship between knowledge and action, or knowledge and practice, and to see, in a way that James did with his whole pragmatist conception, which is misunderstood. It's not like Jamesian pragmatism is just, what's true is what works and what's useful. That's a debased understanding of it. It's a deeper conception of knowledge is rooted in an evolutionary process. Knowledge as part of what biological organisms are developing in the course of evolution. And so I think, Whitehead's trying to show the way toward, a more ecological civilization, which becomes very clear in his later work, like in Modes of Thought. There's a chapter called Civilized Universe, where he says that, my metaphysics is ultimately an attempt to justify the civilized phases of human existence. So I think that's the larger context of his project here.
It's interesting that you have this ethical charge in almost all of these works in this tradition, and that you also have it in Varela. Like in the Tree of Knowledge, they build this entire philosophy of nature, but in the end, the next step is the ethical step, trying to apply these theoretical foundations to really changing the world, changing the way we go about living. And it's really interesting how it's present, and it's also implicit, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an effort to bring back together the Platonic ideas of goodness, truth, and beauty, which modernity differentiated and dissociated, you might say. And Whitehead's trying to bring them back into relationship, so that we don't just, you think of the way that science, art, and religion in the modern period sort of having been more compact and intimately entwined in the medieval and ancient period. In the modern period, science takes the truth as its own domain, and the arts take the beautiful as their own domain, and art has nothing to do with the truth anymore. And then, religion takes the good, doesn't do a very good job protecting that. And so Whitehead's really trying to develop a coherent way of bringing these back together, not to just smush them into one, but to recognize how they mutually inform one another, and that the truth is not disconnected from ethics, and the arts, our relationship to the beautiful, similarly has cognitive import and it has ethical import, right? It's not simply free floating. You know, the arts should not be simply free floating. They have a role to play in how we organize society more broadly.
Yeah, I very much like this line of thought. It sort of relates to something that fascinates me, this idea of philosophy as a way of life, not in some kind of a cliche way, but Pierre Hadot, he has this book of Philosophy as a Way of Life, and he's analyzing in a similar manner how this divorce of truth and beauty, this divorce of philosophy from life, is actually a pretty old thing. It happened already in the Greek times, where you initially had Socrates and Plato as people who were genuinely doing what they were doing because it was what they had to do. It was an existential need to do that in the particular manner, and they did it. But then you eventually develop schools which basically mimic what the predecessors said, and they just interpret and try to figure out what did they really mean. And then it becomes a sort of self-serving philosophy. And I think today you have the similar problem. Science, to what end? Is it the appreciation of beauty in a platonic, platonistic sense? Are we just pursuing truth, or are we trying to figure out some very utilitarian, functional purpose? I don't know, solve some kind of a world problem, or what is really the goal here? And it sort of relates to what we were talking about before, and trying to establish this perspective. What is guiding you? And I think this is something that we should probably start asking ourselves: to what end? Is it just the pursuit of truth that's animating us so much because we have to do it? Do we do it because it's a job, or because we just like fiddling with chemistry and things? Or anyway, I think that this existential dimension of philosophy should probably be brought, and it is brought into the back end of the picture in all of the books we've been reading.
Yes, here.
Also, what I find attractive about Whitehead is that he doesn't postulate some past within which these three, let's say, domains, the beautiful, the good, and the true, are somehow already optimally interrelated, right? So there isn't some kind of, like Husserl does this a lot, like you have this, like the world, I mean, pre-Newtonian or pre-Galilean times were somehow more authentic in the way that they integrated their experience. And I don't get this feeling with Whitehead, right? There is no past that was more integrated than we are. I mean, of course, we have like a much higher degree of specialization, but I don't think this is even the problem for Whitehead, because a low degree of specialization does not, I think, necessarily imply a good integration between this, between the existential domains of our being, right? So and here exactly this is the question, like what is, if you say what is the end goal of science, like what kind of question is this? I think this is a kind of question that was never really grappled with before modern times, like precisely because there was no such practice as science, right? So there was no, this kind of problem didn't really exist yet. And I think this is a kind of, maybe this is very speculative, but I find it interesting how, like, for Whitehead, I think precisely science is something that allows us to grapple with the kinds of beings that we are in a more profound way than we ever could before, or at least, let's say, like it's like, what attracts me is like the picture he gives is that the philosophy is a kind of experimentation with ways of life. And this in this it will give some sort of, if you're looking for answers as to what kind of being you are, you will have to experiment, and you have to arrive at new answers and maybe even pose new questions, as opposed to a picture where you have the sort of integrated being already given and just try to return to a past form of life.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm gonna have to run, you guys, but The conversation's been great, and I will have my work cut out for me next time with these chapters on abstraction and God, but do my best. And see you in, is it next week or 2 weeks?
I think it might be a little longer,
next week.
It might be even a month.
Okay.
You say there was like a month long.
Yeah, I think it's a longer break this time.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I'll wait for the email in any event, and hope you guys have a nice night. I'll see you soon.
See you.
Yeah.
I guess we can just finish the time we have left on Zoom, or are you out of ideas?
Mogoče če prešaltamo v slovenščino. A ja, ne smemo.
Ja, načeloma ne smemo, ja, ker gre na YouTube. Lahko pa v bistvu prešaltamo, pa bomo dali, ja ne moramo. Pa bomo pač izrezali ta del slovenski ven. Da je res, gremo na slovenščino. Ker jaz ne rahno naveličen angliščine. Anyway, kako se zdaj v Whiteheadu pogovarjati slovenščini? To je zdaj the challenge.
Kdo še kaj razmišljal o tisti deli poglavja, ko po mojem so bili tudi najmanj razumljivi, pravzaprav, ali pa vsaj teže razumljivi, ne? Ko daje primer, oziroma ko naredi nek tak twist, ne, da reče, ja, znanost ne, pač ne, mehanicizem, ne, pač zaide v probleme, ampak paradoksalno pa predpostavlja, ampak brez da bi vedela, ne, nek vidik organske, ne, te teorije, ne, ko govori recimo o praznem prostoru, oziroma o dogodkih v praznem prostoru, pa v pač elektronih samih, recimo, ne, kako je kdo to kaj razumel. Ne, še posebej glede dogodkov v praznem prostoru, je zelo tako, je kar abstraktno, recimo, tam našteto, ne, v nekem zelo hitrem sosledju našteje tiste 3 pointe, ne. Ampak je zanimiva ideja, ne, da v konceptu praznega prostora, v katerem pač načeloma fizika gotovo ne pojmuje ravno, ne, pač je tam, ne, in nekaj takšnega kot je prazen prostor. In da ta pač nos podobne karakteristike, češ kot bi jih Whitehead predpostavljal recimo načeloma v tej mrežini teh organizmov, ne, svojih, ne.
Jaz imam feeling, da bi...
Ja, kako je?
Da bi za vse te knjige, ki jih zdaj beremo, rabili še enega fizika, da bi tako moral grounditi še ta aspekt.
Ja.
Za mes tudi jaz pač enostavno premalo vem. Maksa, imaš ti, kaj si se kaj vrgel v fiziko zadnje čase?
Ne, mislim, ne, kot sledim za hec na Twitterju dosti tem matematikom in še pač ljudi v teh sferah, ampak nisem imel časa, da bi probal karkoli bolj razumeti, kot razen tako mogoče kak ta blog post od Wolframa, ko sem ga že prej omenil, preberem pa potem, ko ima ta koncept computational irreducibility, pa tudi tako mogoče, ne vem, ko je recimo Brasjeju bil všeč ta čajtin in omega, pa vse neke te povezave med informacijsko teorijo in matematiko, ampak sem tako vem v smislu, da so te stvari v ozadju prisotne, ne pa da bi jih lahko na bolj resen način preverjati, ampak sem tako kot ta... Ja, se mi pa zdi, da tako Whiteheadova teorija definitivno živi v tem komputacijskem prostoru, ali pa tako kot, tako imam tak občutek, no, mislim, tudi vse te event, pa kako se te stvari tvorijo, pa ti vzorci, kot mislim to, kar sem že prej prav povedal, mi je samo zanimivo videti, kot v smislu, ni čudno, recimo, da je tudi Deleuze ga vzel za svojega, ali pa kakšne te usporednice mogoče, no.
Ja, drugače, kakor sem jaz tekel to, kar si vprašal, Miha, jaz v bistvu mojem, že to sploh prav razumem, ampak jaz sem v bistvu štekel samo to poanto, da je v bistvu prazen prostor lahko enačiš v bistvu s poljem. mislim, se pa imaš več teh tipov polja, recimo imaš pač, mislim, lahko imaš toliko energije, lahko imaš pa, ne vem, pač polje sile, ki sta v bistvu čist drugi, mislim, različna koncepta. In pol je v bistvu vprašanje lih to, kako se, mislim, to pač vprašanje razmerja med tem nekim, med poljem pa med točko mase, ki se znajde v tem polju, ali pa nabojem, pač elektromagnetizmu, kjer pač v fiziki načeloma imaš to, mislim, nikoli ne boš, mislim, polje bo nekaj, kar bo pač modificirano strani, recimo imaš elektromagnetno polje in potem daš noter pač nek naboj, in ta naboj bo pač določil, kakšno obliko bo imelo to polje. Tako da v tem smislu to je eno od teh pač načinov, kako recimo lahko rečeš, da pač ta partikularna stvar pač aficira celo to pač okolje, ne, kako že Whitehead temu reče ta, ne infection, ampak nekaj drugega, pač to, kako se tako prilivajo na te eventi, en v drugega.
Kaj da infekt?
Infekt pa še nekaj drugi izraz uporab, kaj se mi zdi, da je boljš, nisem bolj primeren tle. Pervading ali nekaj tako.
Mogoče pervade.
Ne vem, no, ja. Pač probal sem malo slediti tem, tako kaj je točno zdaj misel, tako kaj vpliva na kaj, veš, pa če imaš to polje in pa to polje vpliva, ta telec vpliva na polje, ampak pri fiziki, nisem tako pač established fiziki, ko reč tekam, nikoli nimaš tega, da bi zdaj to polje kar vplivalo na ta delec nazaj, ne, to pa ni. Mislim, pri Whiteheadu je pač bistveno to, da imaš to full circle pač tega feedbacka, ne, pač izdelal celoto, pa iz celote nazaj v del, medtem ko pri tako mainstream fiziki saj na ravni pač teh pojavov tega ni. Pač,
Ja, klej sem se še spomnil na nekaj, ki pač v Process and Reality tudi malo razdela, pač govori o skupkih teh dejanskih prilik, actual occasions, whatever, pač in govori o teh societyjih in potem jih klasificira v različne tipe societyjev. Recimo prazen prostor je nek specifična vrsta societyja, recimo tukaj, se pravi predstavlja, češ očitno kot nek okvir, nek baseline ali pa karkoli, neko obliko, očitno neke združbe, kao, Pa še na nekaj sem spomnil, ko smo že tudi prejšnjič govorili, ker tukaj, ko govori o tem praznem prostoru, govori o eventu, kot v nekem praznem prostoru. Sem se spomnil to, ko smo že prejšnjič nekaj izpostavili o meji dogodka, pač kako je zdaj zamejen, zdaj. Vse tako sem si jaz razlagal, pač imaš to polje, karkoli, In pa zdaj ta dogodek je lahko predstavlja deloma nek del tega life historyja, nekega eventa, in predstavlja nek del neke potencialnosti sam tega delca, ali pa predstavlja mogoče nek vidik njegove prihodnosti, ali pa kaj, pa skratka, ni tako, da je kratko en delec, kratko, in to je en event, pač the line is a bit blurred, tako malo, spet odvisno, kako ga postavimo, ali kako, pač lahko je ta delec zdaj, ja, realnost tega delca, odvisno, kako definiramo, ta event, potem lahko predstavlja še nek vidik, še nekega širšega tega polja zraven, nekaj takšnega.
Ja, meni se zdi, da sta dve ideji tle tako zelo povezani, pa obe sta zanimivi, ampak lih to je, kje meja nekega dogodka, pač na fizikalni ravni imaš to idejo polja, pač ker točno, mislim, imaš to zabrisanje te meje, pa na ravni recimo pač biološkega organizma sem pa jaz razmišljal, da je to ful recimo povezano s kakšnimi temi idejami iz extended mind, to kar govori tle, ker pač v bistvu zabriše mejo med okoljem pa pač individuumom. Pač v smislu, da na nek način, mislim, lahko rečeš, da je biološki individuum ali pa pač ta žival ali pa človek, da ima pač, da je mentalnost pač, mislim, ta mental side je v bistvu so principi organizacije tega individualnega telesa. Ampak to v resnici ni dovolj, ti pač hočeš, mislim, ti v bistvu zaznavaš to, da bi se okolje spoznaval, tako da to so, in tle pač to, kar on narediš, da sam še doda, da ja, tudi tle v bistvu gre za organizacijo okolja, a veš, v bistvu hočeš reči, kot da obstaja neko psihološko polje, ki je ravno tako kot fizikalno v resnici pač neskončno, pač v smislu prevejda celo tvoje okolje, vse tvoje možne interakcije, In ti zdaj to tvoj mind je v resnici pač, ko bi rekel, neka blueprint za neko tebi optimalno okolje. In v tem smislu si ti, in ti pač, ko interaktiraš z zunanjostjo, pač hkrati nekako, bi rekel, tudi ta blueprint se nekako, konstantno modificiraš glede na tvoje interakcije. V tem smislu je potem, bi rekel, tvoje meje z zunanjostjo so v resnici zelo tako. Po eni strani so bile zablurane v tem smislu, da ni neke prave razlike zate, pač za tvoj mind, ni prave razlike med tvojim telesom in tvojim okoljem, to je samo stvar degrija. Pač v tem smislu bi lahko rekel zelo, pač, da smo orodja, ki jih ljudje uporabljajo, pač zato to lahko recimo mi pač začnemo, ko bi rekel, integriramo orodja kot neke podaljške lastnega telesa. Pa potem naprej bi pa lahko nekako še to, da pač ta feedback loop v bistvu med okoljem in tvojim lastnim percepcijo tega, kaj je tvoje okolje in kaj je tvoj mind, doda še eno raven kompleksnosti ali pa, bi rekel, na neki novi dimenziji zablura pač razmerje med tabo pa okoljem, kar potem rata to komplicirano, da ne znam niti sam več slediti, kje smo zdaj, pa kaj je zdaj, kje se zdaj to polje nahaja. V glavnem, v vsakem primeru hočem reči, da ta polja so tako na različne načine jih lahko vidiš, pa tle mislim, da ni tako enega, veš, ni enega temelja, na katerem bi lahko gradil, pač saj pri Whiteheadu. Ampak so samo pač neke strukturne podobnosti med temi polji.
Jaz sem se spomnil, kaj je tudi v tem chapterju, ko pač v telesu govori, ne pa prav, that the body is a portion of the environment for the part, and the part is a portion of the environment for the body. Ne pač čisto negotovo želi malo, I guess, relativizirati, tako, kaj je pa zdaj nek del v nekem okolju, in kaj je zdaj okolje, ki vsebuje te različne organizme ali karkoli.
Saj mogoče, tu je zanimiva saj ni nujno, da je direktna povezava, ampak malo me je spomnila ta debata na te recimo marksistične teorije, ko Son Retel reče, da kot denar, kot prvotna abstrakcija omogoči vznik filozofije v antični Grčiji, ali pa recimo prehod iz zlatega standarda, konceptualizem v sodobni umetnosti, ali pa take stvari, kot v smislu.
A to Zon Retle reče, ali drug, to za zlatim standardom pa umetnosti?
Ne, zlatim standardom to ne on, to sem na nekem, ne vem točno, kdo reče to drugo, ampak na nekem art podcastu, ko so se o Dušambu pogovarjali, da kao je povezava. Nekateri teoretiki so probali narediti to povezavo, kot mogoče, ne vem koliko prepričljiva je, ali pa je ful razlogov, zakaj še kaj drugega bi lahko vplivalo, ampak mi je samo zanimivo, recimo, kako denar v bistvu, kako močna, recimo, kognitivna tehnologija je. Pa tudi ta v bistvu je neka sinergija med recimo filozofijo tehnologije, ko postaja vedno bolj popularna, in tem, kar pravi Whitehead, in tudi tisto, ko je Matt rekel o tej možnosti, da bo 21. stoletje Whiteheadovsko, kot očitno res obstaja možnost, glede na to, da tudi filozofija tehnologije postaja v 21. stoletju vedno bolj predominantna ali pa tako na nek način powerful. Tako da saj na nek način so kozmotehnike tudi tak specifičen event,
Ja, po mojem ljuku je dosti povezan. Se jaz recimo vidim ful močne povezave med Simondonom pa Whiteheadom tikar, tako da v tem smislu.
Saj je to prav.
Jaz bi se tu navezal na to, kar si prej rekel, Timi, da bi rabili enega fizika tule, ker jaz sem res slabo podkovan v teh vodah, in pri nekaterih te ideje se res sprašujem, kakšen smisel ima, da jaz o tem filozofiram. Tudi če se vržem ful v filozofijo tega, brez tega, da imam to naravoslovno podlago, lahko res kaj smiselnega rečem, ali sem pač pogovarjal o teh stvari z nekega omejenega filozofskega vidika, ki mogoče so popolnoma, pač, ki nimajo nobenega stika s tem, kar se dogaja v fizikalnem svetu. Recimo, zdaj, če bo 21. stoletje Whiteheadovsko, jaz mislim, da je zato nujno, da se Whiteheadovstvo razširi med fizike, ne med filozofi. Dokler se samo pač med filozofi pogovarjamo o filozofiji znanosti, bo pač brali filozofijo znanosti še vedno samo filozofi znanosti. In izziv je tule zdaj, kako dobiti stik z fizikalnim svetom, ker jaz mislim, da Po drugi strani je pa tak, da se mi zdi dosti fizikov, ko pridejo do neke točke raziskovanja in jih zvabi filozofija, ne? Tako kot filozofe na neki točki raziskovanja zvabi fizika, ker pridejo do nekih mej, ne? Spoznavnih, ko rabiš neko drugo orodje, ne? Da premagaš neke ovire. Vprašanje je zdaj, koliko je izvedljivo to, ne? Ker zdaj pač konkreten primer imaš na kognitivni znanosti, kjer se skuša najti to poroko teh dveh pristopov na primeru duševnosti, pa je vprašanje, zdaj, to smo že večkrat načenjali, temu, koliko je zdaj res učinkovito, koliko je uspešno to srečevanje interdisciplinarno, ne, v koliki meri pa pač je provizorično na neki ravni, v resnici pa nekih sintez ni, ne.
Ja, meni se zdi tudi to, da je, mislim, Whiteheadovsko bi bilo po mojem tako trditi, da fizika v resnici ni fundamentalna. Zdaj si predstavljam, da, a veš, da to stoletje je bilo Whiteheadovsko, če bi se z njegovimi termini uspeli pogovarjati med seboj, kaj so jim filozofi, biologi, fiziki. Pač to bi bilo v bistvu najbolj cool, mislim, da to bi bil ideal po mojem tega projekta. Mislim, kar hočem reči, da jaz tudi sam razmišljam tako, a veš, glih na to, pač v tem smislu, koliko je smiselno se zdaj iti pač prav, ne vem, fiziko, ali pa prav kaj drugega. In tle se mi zdi, da meni se zdi, da tle malo zavaja ta dikcija, mislim, on pač sam izhaja iz tega zelo kaj vajen, pač te dikcije, pač fizikalne, ampak to, kar se meni zdi najbolj pomembno pri njemu, tudi nima toliko veze s fiziko. Mislim, to sem mogoče jaz, ko imam druga zanimiva.
Mislim, v zadnji instanci se njemu gre bolj za estetiko, zapravo, ne, kot pa za fiziko. Tako da, po mojem, zame bi bilo še to bolj zanimivo, ne, če bi se v nekem občem smislu znanost ne zbližala za estetiko ali kaj takšnega, ne. Kakorkoli bi to izgledalo.
Ampak tudi taka vprašanja, kot to prej, ne, če rečemo, da imamo, ne vem, fizikalen koncept polja, pa kaj